30 seconds. That's all it took. 30 seconds of post-game footage from a FIBA World Cup qualifying tournament, and suddenly, the two most talked-about women's basketball players on the planet were drowning in a media firestorm that swallowed 3 full days of the sports news cycle whole. Every major outlet grabbed that clip. Every platform ran it on loop. Every hot take machine on the internet had an opinion locked and loaded within the hour. But here's what almost none of them did. They didn't tell you what was actually happening on the basketball court before that camera zoomed in on the handshake line. And that basketball story, that's the one that actually matters. Because what went down during that Puerto Rico game explains everything the clip doesn't. And once you see it, the 30-second version starts looking like exactly what it is, the smallest part of a much bigger picture that the algorithm decided you didn't need. We're going to go through all of it, the real origin of this dynamic, what was happening with the ball during that game, the honest read on that handshake moment without any spin in either direction, and then the Italy game, the story that came right after and received a fraction of the coverage despite being infinitely more revealing. Buckle in, because the full picture looks nothing like the one 3 days of internet conflict built. To understand what actually happened between Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese in that post-game line, you have to start somewhere that has nothing to do with international competition. You have to go back to Dallas, Texas, April 2nd, 2023, a national championship game that 9.9 million people watched, the most viewers a women's college basketball game had ever polled at the time it aired. LSU versus Iowa. And the moment Angel Reese pointed directly at Caitlin Clark in the final minutes of that game, mimicking a gesture Clark herself had used earlier in the tournament, became one of the most dissected and debated gestures in recent sports memory. Reese won that championship. Clark absorbed the loss on the biggest stage the sport had ever constructed. And before either player had ever pulled on a professional jersey, the national sports consciousness had already done something that would shape every interaction they had afterward. It filed them both under rivalry, a label neither player created, neither player fully controls, and neither player has fully escaped since that night in Dallas. That label became a lens, and everything that followed got processed through it. When Clark stepped back from logo distance and buried a 3 against the Chicago sky, it didn't just become a highlight, it became content in a specific rivalry-shaped frame. When Reese was leading the entire WNBA in rebounding, while Clark was simultaneously leading the league in assists, the statistical comparison became less about basketball and more about a proxy war that fans on both sides were already fighting. When they shared a court during Team USA selection, the question on every platform wasn't whether this roster could compete at the international level. It was where the cameras pointed, in which story did they find first. Their individual fan bases, and both are genuinely enormous in ways women's professional basketball has simply never experienced before, had already decided what the Clark-Reese dynamic meant before a single FIBA qualifying game ever tipped off. So when the Puerto Rico handshake clip hit the internet, it didn't land in neutral territory. It landed in ground that had been carefully, relentlessly cultivated for nearly 2 full years. The explosion wasn't an accident, it was inevitable. Here's what the tournament context actually looked like, because the coverage that followed gave it almost no attention whatsoever. Team USA was running through FIBA World Cup qualification without losing a game, putting up margin of victory numbers that reflected a genuinely talented roster operating close to its ceiling. This wasn't a team scraping by, this was a program firing on most of its cylinders in high-stakes international competition that carries real weight for where the program stands heading into the next phase of global basketball. And inside that run, Caitlin Clark was doing something worth noting. She was leading the entire Team USA roster in points, assists, and plus-minus ratings simultaneously during the qualifying stretch, not leading in one of those categories, all 3 at the same time. That's not a footnote buried in a box score. That's the most impactful player on the team performing at an elite level in exactly the kind of competition it matters to perform in. Angel Reese was doing what Angel Reese does: physical rebounding presence, interior toughness, the kind of skill set built to complement perimeter creation and make life miserable for opposing front courts. The team was winning decisively. The program was in strong shape. And then came the Puerto Rico game, and then came the 30-second clip, and then came 3 days that almost nobody spent talking about any of that. Let's be straight about what the footage actually showed, because credibility requires not pretending otherwise. Clark was moving through the post-game acknowledgement line, the standard exchange that happens after every basketball game at every competitive level on the planet, from youth leagues through international finals. She was making contact with teammates in the normal flow of that line. The cameras caught her pivot away before she reached Reese, who was standing with her hand clearly extended. The exchange never happened. Reese was left with her hand out and received nothing in return. The clip was on every platform within minutes, and it looked like what it looked. Here's the honest assessment that some people on both sides of this discourse don't want to hear. The suggestion that Clark simply didn't notice Angel Reese standing directly in her line of sight with her hand extended does not hold up. Not when you understand how Clark processes a basketball court. This is a player who reads the entire floor in real time, who identifies passing angles in cutting lanes before most defenders have even registered that a threat exists, who makes decisions at a processing speed that separates elite playmakers from everyone else. She knew where Reese was standing in that line. She registered the extended hand. The decision to pivot away before completing that exchange was a decision. Whether it came from a calculated competitive response to what happened during the game, or whether it was a split-second expression of frustration that built across 40 minutes of on-court friction, that's something only Clark knows with certainty. But she just didn't see her isn't a read that survives honest scrutiny. The optics were bad, full stop. That 30-second clip does not look like a warm, connected team interaction, and pretending otherwise serves nobody who's actually looking for an honest analysis. What the clip showed is what it showed. What it didn't show is everything that happened before it. Here's the part of the story that got completely buried under the avalanche of handshake discourse. What was actually happening with the ball during that Puerto Rico game? Because throughout those 40 minutes of basketball, before any camera ever zoomed in on the handshake line, something was disrupting how Team USA's offense was supposed to operate, and it matters. Multiple possessions saw Angel Reese advancing the basketball in transition, bringing it up the floor herself in situations where Clark was already positioned ahead, already set up and ready to receive the outlet and push the pace from the perimeter. Team USA's offensive structure is built around converting defensive rebounds into Clark-led transitions at speed. That outlet connection, Reese's securing the board, Clark receiving the ball and initiating before the opposing defense can get set, it's how the offense runs at its highest level. In the Puerto Rico game, that connection didn't happen the way it should have, and it didn't happen repeatedly. Reese advanced the ball herself into ball handling situations that are not her strength, and the result was slower transitions, a few instances where possessions that should have been clean offensive conversions turned over, and a general disruption to the flow the offense was designed to generate.
It wasn't limited to transition. In half-court situations, there were possessions where passes were attempted from positions outside what Reese's skill set is built for, where the safe read was there, where the open look was being generated, but the ball ended up in contested situations rather than finding the shot the offense was creating. On specific rebounds, there were moments where Clark's access to the outlet was delayed rather than accelerated, where the rapid connection that makes the offense function at its best got slowed down in ways that registered in the flow of the game. Now, and this is the distinction that matters most, none of this is evidence of intentional disruption. Athletes are processing information in real time, reading a floor under competitive pressure, making decisions in fractions of seconds. Reese wasn't trying to hurt the offense. Intent is not the question. The question is whether those patterns created genuine on-court friction that Clark was registering as it happened. And the honest answer to that question is yes, obviously yes, because the alternative requires believing that a player of Clark's basketball intelligence, a player who processes and responds to everything happening around her on a court in real time, was completely unbothered by repeated possessions that directly limited what the offense could accomplish. She felt it. She processed every one of those sequences as they were happening, and she arrived at that post-game handshake line carrying 40 minutes of that friction along with her. That changes the framing of the clip substantially. Not excuses what the clip showed, but it changes what that moment actually was. The fan reaction that followed divided along lines that had been drawn long before anybody in Puerto Rico ever picked up a basketball. Clark supporters argued the handshake skip was warranted based on what happened during the game, though notably, even most of those supporters couldn't specifically articulate what in-game events they meant, because the basketball story wasn't the one the algorithm was serving them. Reese supporters called it disrespectful and positioned it as confirmation of something they'd already suspected. Casual observers absorbed whichever framing their feed delivered to them first, and the people who follow women's basketball seriously, who understand what that qualifying tournament actually represented, spent 72 hours watching an actual competitive basketball event get reduced to a secondary storyline. That's the pattern, and it reveals something real about where women's basketball sits right now. Because here's the uncomfortable commercial truth underneath all of it. That 30-second clip, the outrage, the fanbase wars, the comments section battles, the 3 days of media coverage, generated more engagement than most entire WNBA weeks would have produced just a few years ago. And engagement translates, not into something abstract, into real, measurable outcomes that affect real people. Viewership drives broadcast rights negotiations. Broadcast rights negotiations determine what the league can offer players in terms of salaries, travel conditions, facility quality, support structures. Every player in that locker room benefits from an audience that cares enough to argue about a handshake for 72 hours straight, including players whose names appeared exactly nowhere in 3 days of coverage. The conflict that exhausts outside observers is producing commercial outcomes in the background that the sport desperately needed. That's not a defense of the discourse, that's just the reality of what the attention economy does with this level of investment. Clark's arrival in the WNBA specifically generated viewership metrics that changed what the league could ask for in broadcast negotiations. Indiana Fever games were pulling audiences that put WNBA regular season matchups in direct comparison with NBA regular season numbers in certain time slots, a data point that sponsors and network executives memorized and built projections around. When a handshake clip featuring Clark generates more sports media impressions in 48 hours than some entire league weeks previously attracted, that engagement feeds directly into what the next broadcast rights package looks like. The rising commercial profile lifts the entire league, even when the conversation generating it feels like it's tearing things apart at the seams. The social media algorithm's behavior around this story deserves its own examination because it's a phenomenon independent of any of the players involved. Platforms are optimized for engagement velocity, the rate at which content generates interaction, not for editorial significance or contextual accuracy. A clip involving the two most watched women's basketball players on the planet, framed as a conflict moment, produces comment sections where opposing fan bases collide at scale. That collision triggers algorithmic distribution far beyond anyone already following the tournament. Within hours of the Puerto Rico clip circulating, it was reaching people who had never watched a single Team USA qualifying game. People encountering Clark and Reese for the first time, specifically and exclusively through the lens of a controversy. Their introduction to these players was a 30-second snub narrative stripped of every single piece of context that preceded it. That matters, because first impressions calcify. The people who found Clark and Reese through that clip carry an impression that's significantly harder to update than the impression of someone who watched the Iowa-LSU championship, followed both players into the WNBA, understood the qualifying tournament, and saw the handshake moment arrive at the end of a full competitive context. The algorithm doesn't know the difference between those two viewers. It serves them the same clip and moves on to the next engagement opportunity. And here's the thing about resolution, it doesn't perform. The Italy game, which came right after Puerto Rico and showed both players operating as completely functional teammates, received a fraction of the distribution the conflict clip attracted, because resolution doesn't generate the comments section wars that feed the algorithm. Conflict keeps people on the platform. Fixed things don't. So the algorithm buried the more important game and kept amplifying the 30-second version. The Italy game is where the real story finished telling itself, and almost nobody covered it properly. Clark played well. Reese fulfilled her role. The team won. But more than the result, more than any individual stat line, what was visible to anyone actually watching that game rather than scrolling for the next controversy clip was what was happening between those two players specifically. Both of them fine in the way that genuine functional teammates are fine, not performing composure for cameras, not carefully maintaining distance, but actually operating with each other. Eye contact during dead balls, shared reactions on plays, ball movement running the way it was supposed to run between them, the kind of synchronized court awareness that develops between players who understand each other's game well enough to anticipate movement before it happens. Here's why that matters as evidence. Genuine, deep animosity, the kind that 3 days of social media coverage implied was driving everything, the kind the headlines described as a possible fracture in the program's chemistry, does not resolve between Thursday and Saturday. Real interpersonal conflict shows up in body language during timeouts. It shows up in how players position themselves relative to each other when the ball is dead. It shows up in the micro decisions about who gets the outlet pass and who gets a look in the half court, in the ways you can't fake your way through 40 minutes of competitive basketball. None of that appeared in the Italy game. What appeared were two professional athletes doing exactly what professionals do at the highest level, having a moment, processing it internally, and returning to work. Meanwhile, on social media, the fanbase wars were still running at full volume long after the Italy game had already rendered its verdict. The online conflict had acquired momentum that was entirely independent of the players at the center of it. The discourse had grown bigger than the event that created it.
That's the signature dynamic of the Clark-Reese narrative at this stage, and it's worth naming directly. What gets built around these two players in the media ecosystem has grown large enough that what actually happens between them in competitive settings no longer immediately updates the conversation. The players moved on, the internet didn't, at least not on anything resembling the same timeline. And the gap between those two realities is where most of the noise lives. Zoom out to maximum altitude, and here's what this entire episode illustrates. The audience for women's basketball is now large enough that a single moment between two players can generate a news cycle that rivals what major men's sports produce on their biggest days. That has never been true before, not even close. The stakes feel personal to audiences in a way that traditional sports coverage rarely achieves, which is simultaneously what makes the discourse exhausting to live inside and what makes it commercially transformative. The attention, the emotional investment, the willingness to engage at scale with 30 seconds of footage, that's the audience behavior that changes what a league can ask for when it sits down to negotiate its next broadcast package. Every player in the WNBA is operating in a better commercial environment because of an audience that cares this deeply. Even when the conversation it produces is uncomfortable, even when it gets the story exactly backwards. One missed handshake generated 3 days of internet conflict, and then the next game showed both players working together the way teammates work together. That's the full arc. That's professional sports in the social media era compressed into a single weekend. A fracture that wasn't a fracture, a managed moment that the algorithm served as a crisis. In a basketball story, the one happening with the ball during that Puerto Rico game that deserved the coverage and didn't get it because it required actually watching the game to see. The Clark-Reese dynamic is the central narrative in women's basketball right now. It's going to keep producing moments. The algorithm is going to keep serving the surface version of those moments while the substance gets buried underneath. And the teams, the coaches, and the players themselves are going to keep operating in a competitive reality that has very little to do with what the comment sections decide it means. The question worth sitting with now, and the pattern supports this read, is whether what the Italy game demonstrated becomes the template for how this team handles friction going forward. if the internal response is swift communication and competitive refocus, and if that game is proof that the formula works, then what looked like a fracture from the outside was actually a managed moment handled exactly the way a program with serious competitive ambitions ahead of it needs to handle things. That's significant, and it's the story worth watching when the next chapter arrives. Because it will.